Detective Recap here. Today, I'm going to explain a crime horror film called The Tall Man. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. 800,000 children are reported missing each year in the USA. Although most are found within a few days, there are still 1,000 children that disappear without leaving a trace. In the town of Cold Rock, the cops go to the tunnels in search of the recently reported missing children. Finding no trace of the kids, Lieutenant Dodd instructs the local police to put a police line around the area and make sure that nobody goes in or out. Dodd then goes to the infirmary to visit a beaten-up Julia Denning, informing her that they haven't found the missing children. Cold Rock is a small town that's been struck by poverty ever since its mine closed. People blame it for the lack of jobs and money, but something much worse has come to destroy the town. That morning, the townsfolk have no idea that the case of Cold Rock will reach its conclusion. 36 hours earlier, Tracy and Jenny take Carol to the local community clinic, where nurse Julia Denning works. Carol is in agony, and as Julia comes to her aid, they all realize that she's pregnant. Julia delivers the baby, and after making sure that the infant is okay, she tells Carol's mother, Tracy, that they need to take her grandson to the hospital for monitoring. Tracy, however, doesn't want to. As Carol gets to hold her child, Tracy admits to Julia that her boyfriend, Stephen, likes her daughters. She says he's constantly parading around them, showing and teaching them new things. Carol falls for his tricks, but Tracy insists that she didn't realize this sooner. If she did, she would have shot him. Julia then tells her to get rid of Stephen, but to her dismay, Tracy says it's nobody else's business but their own. In Cold Rock, there are times when children are born, but they are not wanted. But even if they are wanted, bad things can still happen to these kids, like disappearing without a trace. The people believe that something sinister has come to Cold Rock, taking their children away. When the case of missing children worsened, the townsfolk started blaming the tall man. Many parents had given their testimonies to the local media, recounting how they lost their sons or daughters. While some don't believe the myth, most are still convinced that the tall man is responsible for the missing children. At the local diner, Douglas and Sheriff Chestnut discuss the possibility of a child abuser preying on the children. When Chestnut is about to explain, Douglas cuts him off and says that the culprit is a bad person who hurts kids and not some evil entity like the tall man. As they talk, Dodd shows up and comments on how Douglas is shooting off his mouth about the case. Defensive, Douglas tells Dodd that he's sure the lieutenant isn't there to catch a ghost, and Dodd agrees with him. When Dodd leaves, Douglas expresses his surprise that the man is back in town. Julia then arrives, and Douglas says that Dodd will once again do his rounds, but it won't matter since their town is already finished. Suddenly, Mrs. Johnson shows up outside the diner, her hair a mess and her face dazed and confused. Julia sympathizes with her, but Douglas doesn't, commenting that she's gone. Julia then takes her cup of coffee and goes outside to give it to Mrs. Johnson, but the poor woman only gapes at her before leaving. Later that day, Julia goes to Tracy's house to visit the baby and finds Stephen cleaning outside. With hostility, Stephen asks Julia what she's doing there, and she replies that she's just picking up the pieces. Annoyed, Stephen warns Julia to stay out of his business, asserting he really cares about Carol. However, Julia only mocks Stephen and tells him that he cares for Carol like he cares for his bike. He brings up her late husband in retaliation, saying he's left Julia some big shoes to fill since he was a doctor while she's just a nurse. Ignoring Stephen, Julia knocks on the door, and Tracy annoyedly answers it. When Julia asks how the baby is doing, Tracy informs her that she sent Carol and her child away to her sister's house in Seattle since it would be better for them to live there. Surprised, Julia tells Tracy that Carol's in no shape to travel, but Tracy doesn't care and even claims that Carol and the baby made it to Seattle just fine. In an attempt to justify her actions, Tracy reasons that she needs to make a living and that she can't stay with Carol and her baby the whole day. While Julia understands, she notes that Stephen is still there as she looks out the window. After Tracy explains that she needs some time to handle her problem with Stephen, Julia asks about Jenny. She finds Jenny reading by the river. There, Julia gives her a new notebook, and the girl thanks her by writing in her journal and showing it to Julia. When Julia asks if she hasn't been doing her speech therapy, Jenny just asks in turn what she can tell the jerk, Stephen. Since Jenny is selectively mute, Julia tries to make her speak, but Jenny only smiles. Jenny then shows her some of her sketches of the tall man, and when Julia asks if she believes that he exists, Jenny writes in her notebook that she saw him. As Julia drives home, Jenny recalls how the tall man was considered to be an ancient legend. People talked about him all the time because they're afraid of him. The townspeople were always afraid that he'd take another child, and when he did, they'd be thankful that it was someone else's and not theirs. When Julia gets home, her nanny, Christine, greets her. Julia asks how her son's doing, and Christine tells her that he's looking forward to her getting home. Inside, Julia goes to her son David's room and hears him singing. She asks him what he did all day, and David explains the science experiment he did with Christine. That rainy evening, Julia plays with David before having dinner. While she's putting him to sleep, David asks her if she still needs to go to work the following day, and Julia tells him that she does, but she'll try not to finish too late. David then asks if they can play again, and Julia promises that they will. Afterward, Julia helps Christine in the kitchen, all the while talking about the day they've had and about poor Carol. Julia shares what Stephen told her, informing her of how terrible she is compared to her late husband. This doesn't surprise Christine, and she mentions that her husband was like a saint in their town who helped everyone out. Julia apologizes for always bringing him up, but Christine doesn't seem to mind and brings out some alcohol instead. After getting drunk, Julia falls asleep while reading a book, and she wakes to the sound of glass breaking. She then hears the radio playing a sermon, so she goes to check if it's Christine. Downstairs, Julia finds no sign of Christine, so she turns off the radio. Confused, Julia goes to the kitchen to drink some milk, and when she turns around, she finds Christine on the floor, bound and gagged, with her nose bleeding. Julia immediately removes her gag and asks her what happened, but Christine only weeps. Julia then rushes to David's room and finds that her son is gone. She frantically searches for him around the house, and as she goes back down to free Christine, she sees the kidnapper by the door, wearing a mask while carrying David. The kidnapper runs away as soon as Julia spots him, and when she tries to go after them, Julia trips over a chair. Not wasting any time, she collects herself and chases the child thief. She catches up to his getaway vehicle, but unfortunately, she slips and falls to the ground. The cargo van suddenly stops, and Julia quickly hides under it as she watches the kidnapper get out and back inside the vehicle. Julia then gets up and peeks inside the van, where she sees David sleeping. Without hesitation, Julia opens the door, and a dog from inside suddenly springs on her. With the dog attacking her, Julia finds a rock, and she hits the dog with it. Weak now, Julia stands and tries to get in the van, but the kidnapper suddenly comes from out of nowhere and knocks her unconscious. An injured Julia wakes inside the moving van with her hands bound. The same dog watches her every move, and Julia tries desperately to untie her hands by scraping the rope against a hole in the wall. When she manages to break free, Julia punches through the glass car partition and wraps her arms around the kidnapper's neck. They fight over the steering wheel, then the dog bites Julia's leg, making it hard for her to take control of the vehicle. As they gather speed, the cargo vehicle hits a fallen tree and gets knocked over. Unscathed, David manages to get out through one of the doors, and it isn't long before the kidnapper follows him. The kidnapper picks David up and leaves the crash site. Unbeknownst to Julia and the kidnapper, Jenny has witnessed everything. Before Julia could get out of the vehicle, Jenny leaves on her bicycle. Finally free, Julia walks toward the direction that the kidnapper took and follows his footprints, leading her to the woods. Julia hopelessly calls out for David, but he doesn't answer. As she walks around, Julia falls through a hole and lands on what appears to be quicksand. Julia luckily gets out of it, and when she sits to take a short break, she sees all her body injuries. Still, Julia continues her search for David, and when she gets tired, she lies down on the road, where Dodd finds her. Dodd takes Julia with him, promising her that they'll catch the culprit. He then takes Julia to the diner, where Trish, the owner, helps her. Before he leaves, Dodd instructs Chestnut to take care of the woman. Everyone at the diner keeps looking at Julia weirdly, but she only ignores them. At Trish's instruction, Julia cleans up then goes to her office, where she hears Douglas and Chestnut arguing outside. Douglas tells the sheriff to go to the mines and find out what Julia's up to, but Chestnut isn't sure what to do. The two return inside, and as Julia changes her clothes, she sees some sort of shrine in Trish's office, where pictures of the missing children are posted on the wall. While looking at the photos, she finds a framed photo of her son David on the table. Unknown to Julia, one of the waiters catches her looking at the children's pictures. He immediately tells everyone what he saw, adding that Julia suspects something. Stephen volunteers to check on her, but Douglas stops him. While waiting for Julia to come back, Douglas gets impatient and looks for her. When he finally realizes that she's gone, he lets everyone know that Julia left and that she's in the forest. Everyone hurriedly leaves the diner then grabs their weapons from their trucks, while Douglas instructs Stephen to bring Julia to him once he finds her. Chester watches as the townspeople rush to the forest, and left with no other choice, he follows them. While driving, Chestnut receives a call from the Central in Seattle, informing him that they're sending reinforcements and that Dodd is chasing the kidnapper. Instead of going to the forest, Chestnut heads to the old mining facility, not knowing that Julia is hiding in his car. As soon as Chestnut gets out, Julia gets out, too, and immediately hides. She hears Chestnut talking to someone, reporting that they've yet to catch her and that she's in the forest. Chestnut then returns to his car and drives away, while Julia finds her way inside the facility. She looks for David there, searching one room after the other until she finally sees him. Julia follows her son to another room, only to be struck and incapacitated by the kidnapper. It is now revealed that the kidnapper is actually Mrs. Johnson, David's real mother. David runs to Mrs. Johnson's arms, saying Julia scares him. When Julia regains consciousness, she finds herself bound in a chair. Mrs. Johnson tells her that it took her an hour to calm David down and to get him to recognize her. She accuses Julia of brainwashing her son, of convincing him that his mother is gone. Increasingly furious, Mrs. Johnson demands to know what Julia is up to. She talks about the previous night, which was just like any other night, where she walked in the woods in hopes of finding her missing boy. By chance, she stumbled upon Julia's house and saw David in the window. Then the next day, she went to Trish, who made an altar for David as she did for the rest of the missing kids. It was the day Julia offered her a cup of coffee, and Mrs. Johnson asks her if she felt worried, guilty, or cynical to offer coffee to the very woman whose child she kidnapped. Mrs. Johnson explains that she waited for Julia and the rest of the people to leave, and when she told Trish what she saw, Trish didn't believe her at first. Julia was a trusted angel face, after all. But when Trish started to have doubts about Julia, Mrs. Johnson told her that she'll break into Julia's house. Trish then decided to keep her diner open all night while everyone waited for Mrs. Johnson's news. But instead of Mrs. Johnson, it was Julia who showed up at the diner. Mrs. Johnson tells Julia that after seeing David in her house, she thought about calling the cops but decided against it since she didn't trust them. All the cops have ever done for her is kick her out of her house, forcing her and David to live in an abandoned building. Still fuming, Mrs. Johnson asks Julia where she took the other kids, threatening to kill her if she doesn't tell the truth. Finally, Julia confesses that she gave the kids to the tall man. Mrs. Johnson asks who the tall man is, but Julia only says that he's the one everyone's been talking about. With her patience thinning, Mrs. Johnson hits Julia and knocks her over. David then enters the room, and Mrs. Johnson promises him that Julia will never hurt him anymore. She then orders Julia to admit to David that she's been lying to him, and as Mrs. Johnson approaches her, Julia punches her in the face, knocking her unconscious. David immediately flees and hides as Julia goes after him, but it's Jenny who locates him instead. When Jenny is about to get David out of there, Julia finds them, and Jenny willingly gives David to her. The three of them leave, and with Jenny's help, they manage to get a truck and drive away. At Julia's house, Christine is nursing her injuries while listening to the radio, and when she sees a truck coming, she immediately greets Julia at the door. Julia informs her that they don't have time since the whole town will be at her house soon before solemnly adding that it's over. Christine carries David to the kitchen while Julia instructs Jenny to go home. Jenny refuses to leave and writes down in her journal that she's sure Christine has called the tall man. She begs Julia to take her to him, too, but Julia refuses, promising that Jenny wouldn't bear it. In the kitchen, Christine distracts David so she can drug him, and when Julia comes inside, she tells Christine that Jenny knows what they're doing. They got sloppy, and Jenny's been watching Julia for weeks. Julia then picks up David, and as she's about to go to the basement, Christine asks her if they'll leave once she takes David. Without answering Christine's question, Julia goes to the basement and comes back alone. She finds Jenny still sitting in front of her house, then tells her that she gave the tall man her name and address. There's a chance that he'll come for her, but if Jenny mentions it to anybody, he will definitely come for her, but not in the way she wants. Julia warns that he'll do things to her that she can't even imagine. Jenny understands this, and she finally leaves when Julia asks her to. Julia heads back inside the house, and while going upstairs, the townsfolk start arriving, demanding her to open the door. She then lies on the couch and falls asleep while Christine watches her from the doorway. Meanwhile, the cops start arriving, too. The following morning, Julia is sitting by the window when a rock suddenly goes through it, almost hitting her. The local police finally take her away, and Dot advises her to keep her head down since they're about to face an angry mob. Before they leave the house, they all see that Christine has hanged herself. Once outside, everyone tries to get a shot at Julia, but the police manage to get her in the car safely. As they drive away, Douglas throws a big rock at the car, breaking the glass and hitting Julia on the head. Meanwhile, the forensics team goes through her house, and Dot and Chestnut learn that her basement leads to the tunnels, serving as a passageway into the woods. Dot then instructs Chestnut to gather his men to search the tunnels, but unfortunately, they find no sign of the missing kids. At the police station's infirmary, Dodd tells Julia that they didn't find the kids. Julia is then taken to the interrogation room, where Dodd questions her about her late husband. He asks her to describe her husband's relationship with the people back then, and Julia says that he kept his community together by helping the dignified town maintain its dignity. But when the mine shut down, people started suffering, especially the children. Julia says she had to do something, so she kept them in her house and took care of them with Christine's help. When Dodd asks her if it's true that she gave the children to the tall man like what Mrs. Johnson claims, Julia claims that she acted alone. Dodd then asks her if it's true that she can't bear children, and Julia confirms it. Finally, Julia admits to kidnapping the children, but when Dodd questions if she killed them, Julia doesn't answer. Meanwhile, the authorities continue their search for the missing children, including David. In prison, Mrs. Johnson meets Dodd, who asks her to appeal to Julia as a mother and to avoid any confrontation so Julia would open up. When Mrs. Johnson faces her, Julia only tells her that there's nothing she can say that will give her comfort. Crying, Mrs. Johnson laments over how much she misses her son, claiming that even though she lives in a dump, she would still die for him. However, Julia only states that pain and defeat are part of a cycle and that the system is broken. It offers them nowhere to turn to for support. According to Julia, it's just easier to give up, and she even adds that she's not better than Mrs. Johnson, she's just seen more. Julia believes that every child is filled with potential and hope. They should nourish that potential, but they don't. Instead, they keep making the same mistakes and continue to let these children grow up broken, just like their parents. Julia says that they have to break the cycle, and that's what she's been doing all along. Unfortunately, Julia's not making any difference because when people ask for real change, all the politicians will say is, "No, you can't do that." There's a process. The cycle just goes on and on while children continue to suffer. Once Julia is done talking, Mrs. Johnson asks if the children of Cold Rock are dead, and Julia admits that they are, saying she couldn't keep them all. When asked if the bodies are in the tunnels, Julia claims they're in the forest, tunnels, everywhere. Defeated, Mrs. Johnson leaves. At Tracy's house, Jenny witnesses Stephen and her mother fighting. When Stephen hurts her, Jenny comes to Tracy's aid, but they are both overpowered and hit by the man. Angry for what her boyfriend did to Jenny, Tracy hits Steven's back with a pipe wrench, but they both laugh about it afterward. Disgusted by what she just saw, Jenny runs off. She goes to a field, where she is finally taken away by the tall man. He takes Jenny to his car and hides her under the seat before driving away. The tall man takes Jenny to an abandoned house, where she is provided with new clothes. He then brings her to her new mother, Mrs. Parker Lee. Mrs. Parker Lee asks Jenny to wait so she can talk to the tall man. He gives her Jenny's newly acquired passport, which contains her new identity as Vera Parker Lee. As she tries to pay the tall man for his service, the tall man refuses to accept it and steps into the light, revealing that he is Julia's husband, who everybody thought was dead. He says the woman who got Jenny there has made a huge sacrifice, and accepting the money would be an insult to her. Julia's husband then leaves, and Mrs. Parker Lee takes her newfound daughter's hand. In Cold Rock, Dodd informs Tracy that they haven't found Jenny yet. Tracy then asks what will happen to Julia, and he says the prosecution is asking for the death penalty. However, it's unlikely that it will be granted unless she confesses where the rest of the kids are. Dodd promises that he will find Jenny before he leaves. As the story of Cold Rock comes to an end, Jenny recalls her first mother, describing her as hardworking and generous. Jenny says Tracy loved her, and she loved her first mother. She then reminisces about her second mother, Julia, who took care of her for just a short time. Jenny states that she isn't sure if she's a good person or not, but Julia loved her, and she loved her second mother. Lastly, Jenny talks about her third mother, who is teaching her about the bigger world. Jenny says her third mother loves her, and she loves her third mother. Jenny has adjusted to her new surroundings and is finally speaking, thanks to Mrs. Parker Lee. As Jenny goes to school, she notes how her world has changed and how she tries to follow its rules. In the park, Jenny sees David with his new mother, who calls him Jeffrey. David seems happy, and when he looks at Jenny, he doesn't recognize her. She guesses that they've forgotten, but Jenny says she isn't like the others. She can't forget. Every morning, she wakes up to the same thought of giving everything up and running back home. But she keeps reminding herself that she wanted this life, and that she made it happen. In the end, Jenny is left questioning if things are really better that way. Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.